Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be another theory/discussion video, and the topic for this video is Cortex has actually already won.
I want to win! It's my turn! Been trying for flipping years!
So, Dr. Cortex is the final boss in almost every single Crash Bandicoot game. He wants to win, and it's not fair. He wants his turn. It's been flipping years. But what if I told you Cortex did win already, and it just went unnoticed? That's what we're going to be discussing in this video. Cortex actually has already won, and he just didn't realize it. So strap in, guys. We're going to talk about how Cortex has already won. Let's jump into it. So the basis for this theory comes from Crash Bandicoot 3, Crash Bandicoot 4, and Crash Nitro Kart, or we can just say Crash Bandicoot, or Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled, since the track in question is in that game. So you're going to need to know some background knowledge on the Crash Bandicoot Warp's story mode. Crash Bandicoot collected all the crystals in Crash Bandicoot 2. So, Uka Uka and Entropy use the Time Twister machine to go recollect the crystals that Crash already collected in Crash 2. So you're going to different time periods to grab the crystals from their original locations in the timeline. So it's not that too confusing of a story. Now where it gets a little weird is some of the crystals that you're going to collect from their original locations in the timeline are actually in the future. How that makes sense, I'm not too sure, but that's canon to the series. So, here you are in the future. And in the future, you can see Cortex Tower, N-Corp or Neocorp. You have engine rockets. And you see a lot of lab assistant drones securing the area. So in the future of the Crash Bandicoot canonical timeline, it seems like in the future levels, Dr. Cortex is already the ruler. So I hear you say, yeah, he was the ruler, but then Crash beats him at the end of the game. So Crash would reset time. But that's not how the franchise is set up, or how the logistics of the time travel in the Crash Bandicoot series actually works. Because you see, if that were the case, that Crash can alter the timeline, then they would have gone back, grabbed the crystals, and then the crystals wouldn't be available for Crash to grab in Crash Bandicoot 2, and thus Crash Bandicoot 2 could not have existed if Crash Bandicoot 3 overwrit the history. So, the timeline is set, Crash gets the crystals, Crash gets the crystals again in Crash 3, but he doesn't negate the fact that he got the crystals in Crash Bandicoot 2, because Crash Bandicoot 2 still had to occur in this timeline. Meaning that no matter what Crash does in Crash Bandicoot Warped, he cannot change the future. He can change the present time that they're currently in, but he cannot change the future. The future is already set in stone. You have Cortex and the futuristic city, and you have engine rockets and Neocorp and Cortex Tower. Had Crash changed history, you would not be able to access the future tense level, the future frenzy level. All the future levels would be inaccessible to Crash Bandicoot post Crash Bandicoot Warped. And I hear you say, oh, well, that's just meta. You can't lock levels out, then you can't go back and play the time trials, blah de blah. However, there's more to this that confirms this. In Crash Bash, you travel to the future through unknown means. There's no time twister in this game. However, you do travel to the future and the past. And in the future, post Crash Bandicoot Warped, you still have the exact same future set up. You have Neocorp, you have Cortex Tower, you have the same buildings. So even though Crash defeated Cortex in Crash Bandicoot Warped, he didn't change the future of the timeline that he's currently living in. He only changed the present. He did not change the future. So if Crash Bandicoot wants to change the future, he would have to actually defeat the future version of Cortex in the future, which he didn't do. He only defeated the present version of Cortex. So, that means Cortex actually wins. At some point down the line, Cortex will either kill Crash or just defeat Crash, and he will take over the planet. And you, like I said, you already saw all the buildings and all the signs. Cortex rules the future of the Crash Bandicoot timeline. That being said, though, we don't know how long his reign actually lasts, because in Crash Bandicoot 4 we get more information on the future of the series. So this is where it comes up to your interpretation on how the timeline is set up. Do you think that Hazardous Waste, which takes place canonically in 2084 of the main timeline, because it doesn't say Hazardous Waste Dimension. This is not a different dimension. This is just a different time period from the main timeline. And it says 2084, and it's a post-apocalyptic Earth. So, do you think that the future levels that we see in Crash Bandicoot Warped and in Crash Bash, do you believe they take place post 2084 or pre 2084? And this is where it all just comes up to personal taste and personal beliefs, because at this point this is what we know that is 100% fact to the Crash Bandicoot lore. Hazardous Waste in 2084 is a post-apocalyptic Earth, and at some point in the future, Cortex seemingly has won. So now this is where I'm going to go into my headcanon theory, because this is purely speculative and is just based off what I think would work well in the timeline with the information that we do have. So we know that Robo-Cortex is a thing, as in he is a canon character now. He was an alternate skin, which is non-canon in Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled, but in Crash on the Run, he's been reintroduced, and he has a character profile, and he is stated to have been created by Dr. Cortex. He's an exact robotic replica of Cortex. So now we know that Cortex has no age boundary now. Even if Prime Cortex is destroyed, Robo-Cortex can take over. So with Hazardous Waste only being 60 years in the future, that would put Cortex at roughly, I think, like 120. Let's do the math. So if Hazardous Waste takes place in 2084, and we know that Crash Bandicoot 1 took place in 1996, that would be 88 years between Crash Bandicoot 1 and Hazardous Waste. So, let's just say Cortex is, we'll say, I know he's not 25, I think he has to be older than 25, but let's just say he's 25 in Crash Bandicoot 1. At minimum, Cortex would already be over 100 years old by this point in the timeline. However, this is where it's up to your interpretation. Do you think Hazardous Waste takes place before Future Frenzy or after? I feel as if it would only make sense for Hazardous Waste to take place after the futuristic city that we saw. Sure, it could be a futuristic world rebuilt over the apocalypse, but I think it's much more likely that we got Cortex took over and we experienced the Future Frenzy level, and then at some point after Cortex has become ruler, there is an apocalyptic event, and then we have a post-apocalyptic future. So, Cortex actually won. Do you think that he would go through with his plans if he knew what would end up with the world? The world will become a post-apocalyptic future. And I'm sure by the time of Hazardous Waste, Cortex has either ceased to be, or he has uploaded his consciousness into the robot Cortex. Who knows? But that's the end of the theory. I believe Cortex does win at some point in the future, but then his victory is a shallow one because he ends up destroying the world. And then I just have another little tidbit that doesn't necessarily have to do with this theory, but it was worth mentioning because we were talking about Cortex wanting to win. So, if you've played Crash Nitro Kart, you would know that at the end of Team Cortex's ending, so there's two endings to Crash Nitro Kart, the Bandicoot side and Cortex side. When Cortex wins, Velo's staff breaks, and Engine, Cortex, and Tiny are transported back in time to Krunk's native Terra planet. Tiny reconnects the broken scepter, and all of Krunk's ancestors see Tiny and they start worshiping him. And thusly, they create Tiny Temple. So that means the canon ending to Crash Nitro Kart, Crash doesn't win. Cortex wins. Because if Crash Bandicoot were to win, Tiny and Cortex would not be sent back in time, and Tiny Temple would not exist. So the fact that Crash can drive on Tiny Temple means that he did not win, and Cortex actually won. So, not only does Cortex canonically win in the main timeline, he will again in the future. So everyone, that's the theory, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you disagree with me for any reason, let me know. If you agree with me and like it, let me know. Give me a thumbs up if you like it, and give me a thumbs down if you dislike it. And I am planning on posting at least one Crash Bandicoot video again every week this year. Last year I did one video a week, and now in 2022 I'm going to try and do the same. So, as always, thank you for watching and viewing and commenting and subscribing and all that great stuff. And if you did manage to stick around to the ending of this video, we're going to have a secret word for you to enter in the comment section. I guess it's a phrase. I guess you can say Cortex's shallow victory. Okay, everyone. You take care. Have a great night.